How many lines of CSS do you think this web app uses? What about this rewrite of it then, which has the same functionality? Well, the first one has 13,415 CSS declarations. If you don't count the duplicate light theme one, it has 6,577. But it ships both, so I think the first number is more fair. The rewrite has 15. Yes, 15 CSS declarations. And you might say, okay, that's pretty impressive, just 15 lines of CSS, but the rewrite looks a lot worse. And while it's subjective, I'm sure a lot of people would agree with you. But can you honestly say that either one of them looks bad? Yeah, sure, less flashy, maybe more boring, but it's not ugly. And it's certainly just as usable, if not more. And let me just remind you again, this rewrite has just about 900 times fewer CSS declarations. And it does support light mode, by the way. I'm not just showing you this to flex. No, this is because I'm proposing a challenge for you. The Minimalist CSS Challenge. The rules are pretty simple. You start off by finding some project that you want, like a website or part of a website or a web app, and rewrite the CSS. You'll probably also need to rewrite the HTML, but the challenge is you set X number of CSS declarations and you're not allowed to use more than that. There are 4 rules. You set the max number of CSS declarations before you begin. I'd recommend 10 to 15 lines if you want to go very minimalist. It'll probably be kind of generic and boring, like this one, not so colorful. But if you want to make it more colorful, maybe get some animations, personalize it a bit, I'd recommend 20 to 50 lines depending on the size of the site and your ambition level. And if it's a web app that's a bit more complex than this one, you might need 50 to 100 lines. But the important part is that you give yourself a challenge. Remember, this is a challenge and you stick to it. If you end up with 57 lines and your goal was 50, that's not okay. You have to put in the work and get it down to 50. You might have to make some sacrifices, but you might find that those sacrifices are worth it. Second rule, you're only allowed to have one file. I know that goes against the classic rule that you have lots of small files so that you don't serve one giant CSS file on the first page load and make that slow, but remember, 100 lines of CSS is not going to be slow. So you only have one file and the browser can cache it, making the loading instant every time you go to a new page on the same site. Third rule, inline styles count towards the total too. This is how we count lines. You open up with F12, DevTools, and then you head to the style editor. I don't know if Chrome has this, just use Firefox. It has the best DevTools anyways. And then you're going to save every single CSS file. Should only have 1 or 2 if you have inline styles. And then you're going to count the number of semicolons in total. Each line ends with a semicolon. But actually, especially if you're using some automated tools, you might see this. If you have an ending parenthesis, you can actually omit the semicolon. Just make sure you don't do that because that would be cheating. And also, this means you have to be really careful with third-party tools because they might just ship a bunch of CSS that you don't write yourself, but it's going to show up here in the browser. Another thing that you want to keep in mind and decide beforehand is whether light and dark mode extra lines count towards your total. Does this file not count at all because it's only for dark mode? Also, this print only stuff, does that count? What about these lines that are only going to get loaded in a browser that doesn't support all the features, old browsers? You just want to decide on that beforehand so you know what the rules are. So, why on earth would you put yourself through this? Well, I have 2 reasons. To make your site better and to become a better developer yourself. The web is super bloated nowadays. Most websites you visit is going to be a giant mess with lots of nested divs. It's not going to be accessible, it's going to be buggy, and it's going to be slow. We need to be better than that. And the way to be better is by being simpler. You might have heard that less is more, and that is especially true with code. Because less code means more accessible, more performant, more usable, it might even look better, and most importantly, it'll be way easier to maintain. The fewer lines of code you have, the less you have to worry about, and the easier it is to fix bugs and stuff. Even if you don't end up using what you write for this challenge, you'll probably find a bunch of ways to make your site better that you do end up using. And if you do end up using the thing you wrote for the challenge, well, it'll probably be pretty good. If you really push yourself in this challenge, you'll have to use advanced features. You'll have to learn new things, learn new CSS, new syntax, new functions, and it'll make you a better CSS developer. You'll also have to rewrite your HTML probably. You need to learn to write semantic HTML. It's gonna save you a lot of CSS because the browser is gonna help you out. And you're gonna need that for this challenge. Bonus points, it'll also make your site a lot more accessible and a lot better. You have to learn how to not nest a billion divs inside of each other. You could make a table with native HTML elements. It'll be way more readable and it'll be way easier to style, or at least require a lot less CSS. So that's why you're gonna be a better developer and you'll make your site better. What's not to like? Now that you know the rules and you know why to do it, go out there and do it. And I'd love to, if you left a comment with your thoughts or your results. I'm actually pretty interested to hear what people think of this, if it helped at all, and what kind of results you got from it. So what are you waiting for? Go out there and do the challenge. Oh, you were waiting for me to give you some tips. Well, that's probably a pretty good idea, because I have some really good tips for you. You don't have to keep watching this, but this would have really helped me back in the day, so it's probably pretty helpful for you if you're new to CSS. As I just said, my first tip is write semantic HTML. The browser is your friend. Look at this MDN page. I'll link this in the description. It has every single HTML element that you can use. Well, you should really just read it front to back. You won't remember everything because there are like 200 things in here, but it'll be in the back of your head, and this is super useful. Trust me. I'll just give you a few examples. Drop down. You don't need JavaScript or CSS for that. There's this details element that just does it for you. A meter? Did you know this existed? It'll change colors depending on what the value is. It's just HTML, no CSS needed. And an abbreviation looks like this. No CSS, that's just how it looks. The browser does all this for you. So let the browser help you. The browser is your friend. It might be boring to read this, but you really should. Also, there's this thing, if you put in the head, meta name color scheme content light dark. If you swap dark light, it'll be dark theme by default. This just helps you out so much. It's literally dark theme for free. Of course, you might still have to make some media rules for light and dark theme, but what I perhaps found to be the best thing about this is the form elements. It makes them dark theme for free. They are so difficult to style, but you just get dark theme for free with this. So if you're gonna have a separate light and dark theme, always put this in your head. When you're writing your HTML, a pretty good tip is to hit Alt, go to View, Page Style, and select No Style. If this is an ugly mess, well, your HTML is an ugly mess and it's going to be hard to style. So make sure your HTML makes sense without CSS, and it'll be a lot easier to write CSS for it. Another good tip is don't load fonts from the internet. You can do that with CSS, but there's really no reason to, because people have fonts on their computers. Look at this. Look at all these fonts. I know they're mostly Noto Sans, but that's a lot of fonts that you can just use, right? You just write Roboto. You don't need to download that from the internet if people already have it on their computers. I'll link this great article that shows how many % of people have what fonts on their computers. So Verdana, for example, is pretty safe to use because almost everyone already has it on their computer. You don't need to waste bandwidth loading that from the internet. Another great tip is to use CSS shorthands. This line right here would have been 3 or 4 lines if I didn't use the shorthand. So go in and find the shorthands, learn them. They'll save you a bunch of CSS and it'll be easier to read. Also, you have to be aggressive in searching for code duplication. If we go look over here, you can see this background size 10 pixels 100%. I repeat that 3 times. If you use smart selectors, and yes, they look a little scary, but they're really not that hard once you learn them, you can save a lot of code duplication, and it'll make changing your mind later a lot easier, and it'll make your code more readable, and it'll get you fewer lines of CSS. Just generally don't be afraid of syntax. Syntax might look scary and it might be a little hard to learn, but that's just how coding is. There's a lot of stuff to learn. Once you do learn it, you can take advantage of it and it'll make your code better. Don't worry if not everyone might be able to understand it, because they can always just look up the syntax and learn it. And you should too. And I guess the whole point of the video is get creative and don't just settle for good enough. You might have done something in one way. Well, there's probably a better way of doing it. So get creative, try new things out, be ambitious. Always try to do things simpler. You'll probably end up writing better code for it. So I think that's a good place to leave you. Now go do the challenge, okay?